The dinner plates were barely cleared when my daughter-in-law Vanessa slid a glossy brochure across my oak dining table. It featured a picture of smiling seniors playing chess under a gazebo. "We know what's best for you, Mom," she announced, tapping the paper with a perfectly manicured nail. My son David stared intently at his half-empty water glass, refusing to meet my eyes. I sat back, resting my hands in my lap. I was 64 years old, in perfect health, and living comfortably in the 4-bedroom house my late husband and I had paid off a decade ago. "I haven't asked anyone to research housing for me, Vanessa," I replied smoothly. "Well, the wait list for the single-story cottages at Sunset Pines is 6 months, she pressed, ignoring my tone entirely. "If we list this house by April, the transition will be seamless. It solves everything." She spoke as if my existence in my own home was a logistical error waiting to be corrected. She already had a timeline pulled up on her tablet. I looked her directly in the eye. "I decide what is best for me. And this house is not for sale." Vanessa blinked, clearly stunned by the firm rejection. David cleared his throat awkwardly, muttering something about traffic before checking his watch. Neither of them expected any resistance. For the past 3 years, I had quietly babysat their son, cooked Sunday dinners, and kept my mouth shut about their extravagant spending habits. Instead of arguing further, I stood up calmly, stacked their dessert plates, and carried them to the kitchen sink. The brochure remained untouched on the table. When I heard their car pull out of the driveway, I poured myself a second cup of tea. The evening was quiet, but I knew this was not the end of the discussion. And the next morning, I discovered just how far Vanessa was willing to go to take control of my space. The silent erasure of my presence began the very next morning. I walked into my kitchen to brew coffee and immediately noticed something wrong. My vintage ceramic tea canisters, the ones my late husband bought during our anniversary trip, were missing from the counter. In their place sat 3 sterile, airtight plastic bins with clean, white labels. I found my beautiful canisters stuffed inside a black trash bag by the back door. Vanessa had proudly announced she was doing some light decluttering while I was gardening over the weekend. I pulled my canisters out of the trash, washed them carefully, and placed them exactly where they belonged. Then I took the shiny new plastic bins and tossed them into the recycling bin outside. I wiped my hands on a towel, feeling a deep sense of clarity. This wasn't about organization. It was about staging. She was systematically stripping away my personal history to make the house look like a blank canvas. Walking into the living room, I noticed Vanessa had left her spare tablet on the coffee table. The screen was still glowing. I didn't mean to snoop, but the open browser tab caught my attention instantly. It was a real estate website showing the estimated market value of my home. Right next to it was an open spreadsheet titled Proceeds Distribution. My stomach tightened, but I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I just observed. They weren't just trying to put me in a retirement home. They were already dividing up the money from a house I still lived in. I closed the tablet, set it exactly where I found it, and walked over to the hallway closet. I pulled out the heavy, fireproof lockbox where I kept the deed to the house. The paper was crisp and secure, bearing only one name, Charlotte Perry. I smiled quietly to myself. Vanessa could plan all she wanted, but she fundamentally misunderstood who actually held the power in this family. By Wednesday, Vanessa's attempts to manage my life shifted from my house to my time. At exactly 6 in the morning, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a text from Vanessa. "Dropping Toby off at 8. David and I have a seminar until 5. There was no question mark. It was a demand formatted identically to the calendar invites she sent her junior marketing employees. For 2 years, I had accommodated these sudden drop-offs because I adored my grandson. But standing in my kitchen holding my phone, I realized my willingness to help had morphed into an unpaid, expected utility. I poured my coffee, typed a brief response, and hit send. I have plans today. You will need to make other arrangements. Less than 30 seconds later, the phone began to ring. I silenced the ringer, slipped the device into my pocket, and went outside to prune my hydrangeas. At 8:15, a car slammed its doors in my driveway. I stayed in the backyard, listening as Vanessa pounded on the front door, eventually using her spare key to storm inside. "Mom! Charlotte!" she yelled, her voice echoing through the empty hallway. I remained seated on my garden bench, completely hidden behind the tall oak trees. I watched through the side gate as she stomped back to her car, dragging a confused Toby by the hand, frantically dialing her phone. I loved my grandson, but I refused to be treated like an on-call employee in my own life. I spent the entire afternoon at the local library, enjoying the silence. When I finally returned home at dusk, I had 14 missed calls. David left a voicemail sounding panicked and annoyed. "Mom, where were you? Vanessa had to miss the morning session." I deleted the message without listening to the end. My time belonged to me, and it was time they learned to respect a closed door. The next phase of their plan, however, forced me to take a much more permanent action regarding the physical boundaries of my home. The following Tuesday, I returned home from grocery shopping to find the garage door wide open. A massive stack of cardboard boxes, a disassembled rowing machine, and 4 heavy winter tires were piled haphazardly near my workbench. Vanessa had clearly used her spare key again while I was out. My 3-bedroom house had slowly transformed into their personal overflow storage locker. Instead of calling David to complain, I simply set my groceries on the kitchen counter and picked up the telephone. I called a local handyman I trusted. "Arthur, how soon can you get over here to swap out 3 deadbolts?" I asked. He arrived within the hour. By 3 o'clock, the front door, back door, and garage entry all had brand new brass locks. The satisfying click of the new keys felt like a heavy weight lifting off my chest. I didn't stop there. I spent the next 2 hours dragging every single box, the rowing machine, and the tires out of the garage. I neatly stacked them on the edge of the driveway right next to the street and covered them with a large blue waterproof tarp. At 6 in the evening, Vanessa's SUV pulled up. I watched from the kitchen window as she marched up to the front door, juggling a stack of mail she had intercepted. She jammed her old key into the new lock. She jiggled it. She pushed hard. Nothing happened. She stepped back, confusion washing over her face, before she noticed the massive blue tarp on the driveway. My phone buzzed immediately. I picked it up on the first ring. "Charlotte, my key isn't working," she snapped, not bothering to say hello. "And why is our gym equipment outside?" I took a slow sip of my water. "The locks have been changed, Vanessa, and your storage lease here has expired. Please take your things home." I hung up before she could formulate a response. Vanessa's fury over the locks was palpable, but David was the one who showed up the next day. He stood on my porch, shifting his weight nervously. "Mom, you can't just lock us out. What if there's an emergency?" he pleaded. "If there is an emergency, David, you knock," I answered calmly, leaving the screen door closed between us. He left frustrated, completely missing the point. Sitting alone that evening, I opened my laptop and pulled up my monthly banking statements. I realized exactly how many invisible strings were still attached to my daily life. For years, I had automatically paid for the family's premium streaming services, the shared cellular plan, and even the auto insurance for David's sedan. It started when he was in college and somehow never stopped. I had been funding the very people who were trying to push me out. I quietly drove to the bank the next morning. I closed the joint checking account that David still had access to and transferred my funds to an entirely new private account. Next, I stopped at the cellular provider. I separated my phone number from the family plan, leaving David and Vanessa responsible for their own devices. I didn't send a warning text. I didn't write an angry letter. I simply cut the financial cord with quiet, administrative precision. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was David calling from a landline at his office. "Mom, my cell phone has no service and my streaming accounts are locked. Did you forget to pay the bills?" He asked, his voice laced with annoyance rather than concern. I smiled, looking out over my peaceful backyard. "I didn't forget anything, David. I am simply retiring my wallet. You are 35 years old. It is time you handle your own expenses." The dead silence on the other end of the line was the most beautiful sound I had heard in months. The financial cutoff sent a shockwave through their household, but Vanessa was not one to surrender easily. She merely accelerated her timeline. A week later, I was reading on the porch when a white contractor van parked on the street. A man in a high-visibility vest walked up my driveway carrying a laser measuring tool and a thick clipboard. "Good morning," he called out cheerfully. "I'm here for the open concept estimate. Vanessa booked me to measure the load-bearing walls between the kitchen and the living room." I didn't stand up. I simply lowered my book. "I'm afraid Vanessa made a mistake," I replied steadily. "This home belongs to me and there will be no remodeling. You can send her the cancellation invoice." The contractor looked confused, glancing at his clipboard, then tipped his hat and walked away. I went back inside and noticed a piece of mail that had been mistakenly delivered to my box instead of David's. It was a notice from a private lending company. It wasn't my habit to read others' mail, but the bright red "Final Notice" stamp caught my eye. The letter outlined a massive delinquency on a high-interest business loan Vanessa had taken out for her failing boutique venture. Everything suddenly snapped into sharp focus. They weren't trying to move me into a retirement community because they cared about my safety or my knees. They were drowning in severe debt. They needed the massive equity sitting in my paid-off house to bail them out of their own reckless financial choices. My home wasn't just an inconvenience to them. It was their emergency parachute. I folded the letter, placed it carefully in an envelope, and mailed it back to their address. I felt no panic, only a cold, hard clarity. They had treated me like a pawn on their financial chessboard, but they had drastically underestimated my ability to see the entire board, and I was about to change the rules. The contractor's cancellation was the final spark that ignited the powder keg. Less than 2 hours later, David's car skidded into my driveway. He and Vanessa marched up the front steps, faces flushed with anger. I stepped out onto the porch and crossed my arms, refusing to let them inside my sanctuary. "You humiliated me," Vanessa yelled, completely abandoning her polished corporate persona. "Do you know how hard it was to book that contractor? We need the equity from this house, Charlotte. We are drowning, and you are sitting here alone in 4 empty bedrooms like a selfish hoarder." David stood slightly behind her, looking miserable and exhausted. "Mom, we were going to use the house to consolidate our debt," he muttered softly. "We would have paid you back eventually. It was for the family. You were going to sell my home to fund a lifestyle you cannot afford." I answered, my voice dangerously calm. "You lied to me, manipulated me, and treated me like an incompetent burden." Vanessa narrowed her eyes, playing her final desperate card. "If you want to be this stubborn, fine. But don't expect us to bring Toby around anymore. You won't see your grandson until you start cooperating." She expected me to crumble. She expected me to beg to offer a compromise to hand over the deed in exchange for Sunday visits. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, but he simply stared at his shoes. A deep ache settled in my chest, but my spine remained perfectly straight. I looked directly into Vanessa's eyes and nodded slowly. Using a child as a weapon is a cruel choice, but if that is your decision, I accept it. Goodbye, Vanessa. Goodbye, David. I turned around, walked inside, and locked the heavy brass deadbolt behind me. I did not look back. They truly believed the silence would break me. For the first 2 weeks, the house was remarkably quiet. No sudden text messages demanding my time, no unwanted boxes dumped in my hallway. and no condescending lectures about my future. Instead of falling into despair, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I realized I had been living under the constant, suffocating weight of their expectations. The following Saturday, I went through the entire house. I gathered every stray item they had ever left behind. David's old college trophies, Vanessa's extra boutique inventory, and winter coats they couldn't fit in their cramped apartment closets. I packed everything into neat, sturdy cardboard boxes. I didn't call them to arrange a pickup. Instead, I hired a local delivery driver with a large box truck. I handed him an envelope with their address and paid him handsomely in cash. "Leave it all neatly on their front porch," I instructed with a polite smile. I didn't include a nasty note or a dramatic letter. The delivery itself was the definitive message. My home was officially purged of their presence. That afternoon, I went to the local garden center. I bought 3 new rose bushes and spent hours digging in the rich, dark soil. The sun warmed my back, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to check my watch to see if I needed to rush inside to babysit or prepare a meal for people who didn't respect me. When evening fell, I sat on my patio with a glass of crisp white wine. I watched the fireflies dance across the lawn. The threat of withholding my grandson hurt deeply, but I knew that giving in to emotional blackmail would only teach them that I could be easily controlled. I chose peace over subjugation. My house was finally my own again, and I was in charge. 3 months slipped by, and the transition was beautiful. I repurposed the spare bedroom they had always treated as their personal storage unit. I painted the walls a soft, warm yellow, bought a comfortable reading chair, and set up a small art studio for my watercolor painting. I joined a local historical society and started taking morning walks with my neighbor Diane. My life expanded to fill the space they had once aggressively occupied. Through the neighborhood grapevine, Diane gently informed me of what was happening across town. Without my house to borrow against, and without my wallet covering their daily expenses, David and Vanessa's financial reality had crashed down on them. They were forced to sell their luxury SUV and downgrade to a much smaller, affordable rental unit. Vanessa had to take a regular corporate job to pay off her boutique's debts, and they finally had to pay for a licensed after-school program for Toby, instead of relying on my free labor. They learned the hard way that the selfish hoarder they so desperately wanted to institutionalize was the very foundation holding their extravagant lifestyle together. I didn't gloat, and I didn't reach out to rescue them. Rescuing them had been my biggest mistake. One crisp Tuesday evening in late October, I was sitting in my new reading room enjoying a cup of chamomile tea and a good mystery novel. The house was perfectly warm, smelling faintly of cinnamon and old paper. Suddenly, the sharp chime of the doorbell echoed through the quiet hallway. I wasn't expecting any packages, and Diane always texted before coming over. I set my book down, walked slowly to the front entrance, and peered through the peephole. Standing on my front porch, shoulders slumped and hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, was my son. He looked utterly exhausted, completely stripped of all the arrogant corporate bravado he had worn months ago. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and opened the door. David stood under the porch light, refusing to meet my eyes. "Hi, Mom," he mumbled quietly. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, allowing him into the foyer, but I did not lead him into the living room. "What do you need, David?" I asked directly. He shifted uncomfortably. "Vanessa and I are struggling. The rent on the new place is due and we're short. I just need a small loan. Just until my next commission check." He finally looked up, his eyes silently pleading. In the past, I would have immediately reached for my checkbook. I would have smoothed over the crisis to keep the peace. But I simply looked at my son, feeling a profound sense of closure. "No, David," I replied softly but firmly. "The Bank of Mom is permanently closed." He flinched, but he didn't argue. He knew he had no leverage left. "I can offer you a warm meal." I continued gesturing toward the kitchen. "I have leftover roast chicken. You are always welcome at my table as my son, but I will never finance your mistakes again." He stood in the hallway for a long moment, the reality of the new boundaries finally settling over him. He realized I wasn't punishing him. I was simply refusing to be a participant in his chaos. He slowly took off his coat and nodded. "A plate of food sounds really good right now, Mom," he whispered. We ate at the oak dining table in comfortable silence. He didn't mention the glossy brochures, the appraisals, or the retirement homes. After he washed his own dishes and left, I locked the door behind him. I stepped out onto my back patio, breathing in the cool night air. I was a mother, a grandmother, and a widow. But above all, I was the sole author of my own life, and my home was finally mine. Here's the biggest takeaway from Charlotte's journey. Getting older doesn't mean giving up the driver's seat in your own life. Setting boundaries isn't about being selfish. It's about self-respect. We spend decades building our homes, our routines, and our peace of mind. We should never let anyone make us feel like an inconvenience in our own space. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do for your family is to stop catching them when they fall, especially if they're trying to push you out of the way in the process. Your home, your finances, and your time belong entirely to you. Never apologize for protecting your peace. If Charlotte's story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to draw a hard line with your own family, I'd love to hear about it. What would you have done in her shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, share it with someone who might need a little reminder of their own strength, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about real-life tough choices and taking back control. Thanks so much for spending your time with me today, and I'll see you in the next video.